Marcus Wellington had always believed that money could buy anything. At 38 years old, he controlled a tech empire worth billions, and his arrogance matched his bank account. His company, Wellington Dynamics, had made him one of the youngest billionaires in America. But success had poisoned his soul with pride and contempt for anyone he considered beneath him. On this particular autumn morning, Marcus stepped out of his custom Rolls-Royce Phantom outside Buckingham Palace, in London. He wore a $5,000 Italian suit and a watch that cost more than most people's homes. The British government had invited him for a private meeting about a massive defense contract that could make his company even more powerful. The two royal guards stood motionless at their posts, their red uniforms pristine and their faces emotionless. Marcus had read about these soldiers online during his flight from New York. He knew they were highly trained military personnel, but in his twisted mind, they were just dressed-up mannequins meant to entertain tourists. As Marcus approached the palace entrance, he noticed a small crowd of tourists taking photos with the guards. The sight disgusted him. These people were wasting time on silly traditions while he had important business to conduct. He pulled out his platinum phone and began making calls, speaking loudly about million-dollar deals as he walked past the tourists. The guard closest to Marcus was Sergeant James Morrison, a decorated soldier who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Before joining the Queen's Guard, James had seen real combat, saved lives under fire, and earned medals for his bravery. But Marcus saw only a costume and a tourist attraction. "Move aside," Marcus barked at a group of elderly tourists who were slowly walking near the guard post. "Some of us have actual important business here." The tourists looked startled and quickly stepped away, apologizing quietly. Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out his invitation, waving it dramatically in the air. "I'm Marcus Wellington," he announced loudly to anyone within hearing distance. "Wellington Dynamics. Maybe you've heard of us? We make the software that runs half the world's defense systems." The tourists murmured among themselves, some recognizing the name from news articles about tech billionaires. Marcus smiled smugly, enjoying the attention and recognition. He loved being the most important person in any room, or in this case, any palace courtyard. Sergeant Morrison remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead as his training demanded. The Queen's Guard were famous for their discipline and their ability to ignore distractions. James had stood guard in scorching heat, freezing rain, and through countless attempts by tourists to make him break character. But Marcus interpreted the guard's stillness as ignorance and disrespect. In his world, everyone acknowledged his presence with enthusiasm. Waiters rushed to serve him, employees jumped at his commands, and government officials treated him like royalty. The guard's professional composure felt like a personal insult. "Excuse me," Marcus said, stepping directly in front of Sergeant Morrison. "I'm talking to you." When the guard maintained his position and continued staring ahead, Marcus felt his anger rising. His face reddened, and his voice grew louder. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus demanded, moving even closer to the guard. The tourists nearby began to sense tension and started pulling out their phones to record what was happening. "I employ more people than live in whatever village you crawled out of." Still, Sergeant Morrison remained motionless. His training had prepared him for much worse than an angry businessman. During his military service, he had faced enemy fire without flinching. One entitled civilian would not break his discipline. Marcus's anger reached a boiling point. He was used to immediate responses when he spoke. In his corporate world, silence meant submission or fear. He interpreted the guard's professionalism as defiance and stupidity. "You're just a dressed-up dummy," Marcus snarled, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Several palace security officers began moving closer, sensing the situation was escalating. A toy soldier playing dress-up for tourists. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, and dozens of phones were now recording the confrontation. Marcus was too angry to notice or care about the cameras. His pride had been wounded by what he saw, as disrespect from someone he considered far beneath his status. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Marcus shouted, grabbing the guard's arm. The moment he made physical contact, several things happened simultaneously. Palace security began moving rapidly toward the scene. The crowd gasped and stepped back, and Sergeant Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But the guard still did not break position. His training and professionalism held firm even as this arrogant businessman crossed lines that should never be crossed. James had sworn an oath to protect the royal family and uphold the honor of his regiment. No amount of insults or physical contact would make him abandon his duty. Marcus released the guard's arm and stepped back, his face now purple with rage. The combination of jet lag, stress from important business meetings, and his natural arrogance had created a perfect storm of entitled fury. Without warning, Marcus gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly at Sergeant Morrison's face. The spit landed on the guard's cheek and began to run down toward his collar. The crowd gasped in shock, and the sound of camera phones recording became almost deafening. For a brief moment, the entire courtyard fell silent. Even Marcus seemed surprised by his own actions, though his anger prevented any immediate regret. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, insulting not just one soldier but the entire tradition and honor of the Queen's Guard. Sergeant Morrison felt the warm spit on his face but remained motionless. Inside, his heart was pounding with controlled rage, but his training held firm. He was a professional soldier, and professional soldiers did not abandon their posts because of disrespectful civilians, no matter how disgusting their behavior. But Marcus Wellington was about to learn that actions have consequences, especially when those actions are recorded by dozens of cameras and witnessed by crowds of people. The harsh reality check he was about to receive would change his life forever. The silence lasted only seconds before chaos erupted around Marcus Wellington. Palace security officers moved with swift precision, surrounding him before he could fully process what he had done. The lead security officer, Inspector David Hayes, had witnessed the entire incident from his monitoring station and was already coordinating the response through his radio. "Sir, step away from the guard immediately," Inspector Hayes commanded as he approached Marcus. His voice carried the authority of someone who had handled diplomatic incidents involving world leaders and foreign dignitaries. This was not his first encounter with entitled visitors who forgot where they were. Marcus turned toward the security officer, his arrogance still intact despite the growing crowd of onlookers. "Do you know who I am?" he repeated, as if his wealth and status could somehow undo what had just happened. "I have a meeting with government officials in 20 minutes. This is ridiculous." Inspector Hayes had reviewed Marcus's credentials earlier that morning as part of standard security protocol. He knew exactly who Marcus Wellington was, which made the situation even more serious. This was not some random tourist having a breakdown. This was a prominent businessman whose actions would have serious diplomatic and legal consequences. "Wellington, you are under arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard," Inspector Hayes announced clearly, ensuring his words were audible to the recording devices held by dozens of tourists. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be used as evidence against you." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his world of corporate power and financial influence, he had never faced real consequences for his behavior. His army of lawyers usually handled any problems before they became serious, and his wealth had always provided a buffer between him and accountability. "This is insane," Marcus protested, as security officers moved to restrain him. "I spat at a costume performer. This is barely even a misdemeanor." His fundamental misunderstanding of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present. He genuinely believed that royal guards were theatrical performers rather than active military personnel. Sergeant Morrison finally received permission through his earpiece to step down from his post. As he moved to wipe the spit from his face, the crowd could see the controlled anger in his eyes. The dignity with which he handled the situation impressed the tourists, who began murmuring their support for the guard and their disgust at Marcus's behavior. "That guard is Sergeant James Morrison," Inspector Hayes explained as handcuffs were placed on Marcus's wrists. "He's a decorated war veteran who has served his country with honor in Afghanistan and Iraq. You didn't spit at a performer, Mr. Wellington. You assaulted a British soldier in the course of his duties protecting the crown." The blood drained from Marcus's face as the reality began to sink in. His expensive lawyers were thousands of miles away in New York, and his corporate influence meant nothing in the British legal system. For the first time in decades, his money and status could not immediately solve a problem he had created. The tourists continued filming as Marcus was led away, their phones capturing every moment of his arrest. Social media was already beginning to buzz with the first uploaded videos tagged with phrases like "Entitled CEO" and "Royal Guard Assault." The viral storm was beginning, though Marcus remained unaware of the digital wildfire he had ignited. As they walked toward the security building, Inspector Hayes continued to explain the severity of the situation. "Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is considered an attack on the Crown itself," he said calmly. "This is not a matter that will be handled lightly by the courts or the media." Marcus's scheduled meeting with government officials was immediately cancelled. His contact at the Ministry of Defense, Sarah Chen, received an urgent call informing her that the American businessman they were supposed to meet had just been arrested for assaulting a royal guard. Sarah had been prepared to discuss a billion-dollar defense contract. Instead, she was now dealing with an international incident. "Cancel everything," Sarah instructed her assistant after ending the call with palace security, "and prepare a statement distancing the ministry from Mr. Wellington's actions. This is going to be a public relations nightmare." Meanwhile, the videos from the courtyard were spreading across social media platforms at an incredible rate. Within 30 minutes of the incident, the first video had been viewed over 50,000 times on various platforms. Comments poured in from around the world, with viewers expressing shock at Marcus's behavior and admiration for Sergeant Morrison's professionalism. In the security holding area, Marcus was processed like any other criminal. His designer suit and expensive accessories meant nothing as he was photographed, fingerprinted, and searched. The officers treated him professionally but without any special consideration for his wealth or status. "I want to call my lawyer," Marcus demanded as he sat in the holding cell. The reality of his situation was finally beginning to penetrate his arrogance. "This is going to be resolved very quickly once my legal team gets involved." But Inspector Hayes had already contacted the American embassy to inform them of the situation. The embassy staff were preparing their own response, knowing that this incident would create significant diplomatic complications. An American citizen assaulting a British Royal Guard was exactly the kind of international incident that could strain relationships between allies. Marcus's phone, now in police custody, as evidence, was buzzing constantly with calls and messages. His assistant in New York had seen the early social media posts and was trying frantically to reach him. The company's stock price was already beginning to fluctuate as news of the arrest spread through financial networks. The harsh reality was setting in rapidly. Marcus Wellington, who had built his empire on the belief that money could solve any problem, was discovering that some lines could not be uncrossed with wealth and influence. His moment of entitled rage was becoming a public spectacle that would haunt him far longer than he could imagine. As he sat in the cell, still wearing his $5,000 suit but now with handcuffs and a booking number, Marcus began to understand that his carefully constructed world of privilege and power was crumbling around him. The Royal Guard he had so casually disrespected remained at his post, continuing his duties with the same professionalism he had maintained throughout the assault. The consequences were just beginning. By evening, Marcus Wellington's assault on the Royal Guard had become global news. The videos recorded by tourists were being broadcast on major news networks around the world, and social media platforms were overwhelmed with shares, comments, and reactions. The hashtag entitled CEO was trending in 12 countries, and Marcus's name was becoming synonymous with arrogance and disrespect. In his cell at the Metropolitan Police Station, Marcus remained largely unaware of the digital storm, destroying his reputation. He had been allowed one phone call which he used to contact his head lawyer in New York, Robert Steinberg. The conversation did not go as Marcus expected. "Marcus, what the hell were you thinking?" Robert's voice was sharp with frustration. "Do you have any idea what's happening here? Your company's stock has dropped 18% in 6 hours. The board is in emergency session and I've had 47 media calls asking for statements about your arrest." Marcus felt the first real tremor of fear. His company, Wellington Dynamics, was his life's work and the source of his power and identity. The possibility that his moment of rage could threaten his business empire had never occurred to him during his angry confrontation with the guard. Just get me out of here, Marcus demanded. Pay whatever bail they want. Hire the best. Lawyers in London. This needs to disappear quickly. His voice carried the same commanding tone he used in boardroom meetings, but Robert could hear the underlying panic. It's not that simple, Robert explained. You're not just dealing with a simple assault charge. You attacked a representative of the British Crown while being recorded by dozens of witnesses. This is an international incident involving military personnel. The British legal system doesn't work like ours, and your usual approach of throwing money at problems isn't going to work here. Meanwhile, Sergeant James Morrison had completed his shift and returned home to his modest apartment in East London. Unlike Marcus's penthouse lifestyle, James lived simply on his military salary, sharing a small flat with his girlfriend Emma, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Emma had seen the news coverage during her break at the hospital. Her colleagues were talking about the American businessman who had spat at a British soldier, not knowing that the soldier was her boyfriend. When James walked through the door, still in his uniform, Emma immediately embraced him. I saw what happened, she said softly. Are you all right? I can't believe someone would do that to you. James had rarely spoken about the challenges of his job, preferring to keep his military duties separate from his personal life. I'm fine, James replied, though Emma could see the tension in his shoulders. It's part of the job. We're trained to handle much worse than entitled businessmen having tantrums. But privately, James felt the weight of being thrust into an international spotlight. He had joined the Queen's Guard to serve his country, not to become a symbol in a viral video. Back at Wellington Dynamics headquarters in New York, the company's crisis management team was working overtime. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting, and several major clients were reconsidering their contracts. The defense contract that Marcus had traveled to London to secure was now completely off the table, representing a loss of nearly $2 billion. Jennifer Walsh, the company's head of public relations, was fielding calls from reporters around the clock. Mr. Wellington's actions do not represent the values of Wellington Dynamics, she repeated in carefully crafted statements. We are cooperating fully with authorities and conducting our own internal review of this incident. But the damage was accelerating beyond corporate control. Video clips of Marcus spitting at the guard were being remixed into memes and commentary videos. Late-night television hosts were using the footage as material for monologues about entitled wealth and American arrogance abroad. The story had captured the public imagination as a perfect example of privilege meeting consequences. In London, Inspector Hayes was coordinating with multiple agencies as the case grew in complexity. The American embassy had sent representatives to discuss the diplomatic implications, while the Ministry of Defense was concerned about the impact on military relations between the two countries. This isn't just a simple assault case anymore, Inspector Hayes explained to his superiors. We have an American business executive who attacked a British soldier while being recorded by international tourists. Every decision we make will be scrutinized by media on both sides of the Atlantic. The British tabloids were having a field day with the story. Headlines screamed about American arrogance and British dignity, with side-by-side photos of Marcus in his expensive suit and Sergeant Morrison in his military uniform. The narrative of entitled wealth versus honorable service resonated strongly with the British public. Marcus's wife, Victoria, was watching the news coverage from their Manhattan penthouse when her phone began ringing constantly. Friends, reporters, and business associates were all trying to reach her for comments about her husband's behavior. Victoria had always enjoyed the lifestyle that Marcus's success provided, but she had never imagined that his arrogance could lead to such public humiliation. Mrs. Wellington, this is Rachel Kumar from The Times, one voicemail began. We'd like to get your perspective on your husband's arrest and whether you think his behavior reflects a pattern of entitlement that has gone unchecked in corporate America. Victoria realized that she was now part of the story, whether she wanted to be or not. Her social media accounts were flooded with comments and messages from strangers around the world. Some were supportive, but many were critical and harsh, blaming her for enabling Marcus's arrogant behavior. The Wellington Dynamics board meeting was tense and difficult. Several board members were calling for Marcus to step down as CEO, while others wanted to wait and see how the legal situation developed. The company's stock continued to fall as investors lost confidence in leadership that could create such an unnecessary international incident. "We need to consider all options," said board member Patricia Kim, a former government official with experience in crisis management. "Marcus's personal behavior has become a liability to the company and our shareholders. We have a duty to protect Wellington Dynamics, even if that means protecting it from its own founder." As night fell in London, Marcus remained in his cell, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. His moment of entitled rage had triggered a cascade of consequences that his wealth and influence could not simply erase. The royal guard he had so casually disrespected was being hailed as a hero for his professionalism, while Marcus was becoming a global symbol of everything wrong with unchecked privilege and arrogance. The harsh reality check was deepening with each passing hour, and Marcus was starting to realize that some mistakes could not be undone with money, lawyers, or corporate power. His assault on Sergeant Morrison had been recorded, broadcast, and immortalized in the digital age, ensuring that this moment of shame would follow him for the rest of his life. Marcus Wellington's first night in British custody was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The cell was small, cold, and filled with the sounds of other prisoners who showed him no respect or recognition. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his usual commanding presence had completely disappeared. For the first time in decades, he was just another criminal waiting for justice. Outside the jail, the media circus was growing, larger. News vans from major networks had parked along the street, and reporters from around the world were preparing stories about the American CEO who had attacked a British soldier. The contrast between Marcus's privileged background and his current situation was irresistible to journalists seeking dramatic narratives. The morning brought Marcus's first court appearance, where he would face a magistrate to hear the formal charges against him. His London legal representative, Barrister Elizabeth Hartwell, had been hastily arranged by his American lawyers. Elizabeth was experienced in high-profile cases, but she had never dealt with anything quite like this combination of international attention and clear video evidence. "Mr. Wellington," Elizabeth explained during their brief meeting before court, "you need to understand that this is not going away quietly. The Crown Prosecution Service is treating this very seriously, and the public attention makes it impossible for them to show leniency. Your best option is to plead guilty and hope for a reduced sentence." Marcus's arrogance flared again. "Reduced sentence? I'm not pleading guilty to anything. It was barely even an assault. I spat at someone who was ignoring me. In America, this would be a minor misdemeanor at worst." His fundamental inability to understand the gravity of his situation remained intact despite a night in jail. "Mr. Wellington, you assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard," Elizabeth said firmly. "In British law, this is equivalent to attacking a representative of the Crown itself. The maximum penalty is 2 years in prison, and given the public attention and video evidence, the prosecution will seek significant jail time." The courtroom was packed with media representatives and curious members of the public who had followed the story online. Security was tight as Marcus was led in wearing handcuffs and the same wrinkled suit from the day before. The contrast with his usual polished appearance was striking and provided perfect imagery for the news cameras. Magistrate Helen Morrison, no relation to Sergeant Morrison, presided over the hearing with stern efficiency. She had reviewed the case files and video evidence thoroughly, and her expression made it clear that she was not impressed by Marcus's behavior or his attempts to minimize the severity of his actions. "Mr. Wellington," Magistrate Morrison began, "you stand accused of assaulting Sergeant James Morrison of the Grenadier Guards while he was performing his duties as a member of the Queen's Guard. How do you plead to these charges?" Elizabeth Hartwell had advised Marcus to plead guilty, but his pride and arrogance overruled legal wisdom. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Marcus said loudly, causing murmurs throughout the courtroom. The decision shocked Elizabeth, who realized that her client was about to make his situation much worse. The magistrate set a trial date for 6 weeks later, denied bail due to flight risk concerns, and remanded Marcus to Pentonville Prison to Wait trial. The denial of bail sent shockwaves through the courtroom, as Marcus had assumed his wealth would guarantee his freedom during the legal proceedings. Your Honor, my client has significant business responsibilities and no criminal history, Elizabeth protested. Surely bail can be arranged with appropriate conditions. But Magistrate Morrison was unmoved by arguments about Marcus's corporate obligations. Mr. Wellington demonstrated complete disregard for British law and military personnel, the magistrate replied. His considerable wealth and international business connections make him a significant flight risk. Bail is denied. As Marcus was led away to begin his stay in one of Britain's most notorious prisons, the reality of his situation finally began to penetrate his denial. Pentonville Prison housed serious criminals, and Marcus's privileged lifestyle had not prepared him for the harsh realities of the British penal system. Meanwhile, the global reaction to Marcus's not guilty plea and denied bail intensified the media coverage. Financial networks were analyzing the impact on Wellington Dynamics, which had lost over 30% of its value since the incident. The company's board was meeting in emergency session to consider removing Marcus as CEO, regardless of the legal outcome. Sergeant James Morrison was also dealing with unwanted attention, though of a very different kind. His professionalism during the assault had made him a hero to many people around the world, and he was receiving messages of support from military personnel, civilians, and even government officials. James, the Ministry of Defense wants to meet with you, his commanding officer, Colonel Andrew Davies, explained. They're considering using this incident as an example of military professionalism under pressure. You might be looking at a commendation or promotion. James felt uncomfortable with the attention. Sir, I was just doing my job. Any guard would have handled it the same way. I don't want to become a poster boy for military discipline. But Colonel Davies explained that the situation was beyond James's personal preferences now. This has become bigger than any of us intended, the colonel said. The way you handled that assault has become a symbol of British military values. The ministry feels that recognizing your professionalism could help restore confidence in our institutions. Back in New York, Victoria Wellington was facing her own crisis. The wives of other corporate executives were distancing themselves from her, and she was being asked to resign from several charitable boards where she had served for years. Her comfortable social world was crumbling as people associated her with Marcus's behavior. Mrs. Wellington, perhaps it would be best if you stepped down from the museum board, suggested Margaret Ashford, the chairwoman of the Metropolitan Museum's Development Committee. Your presence is becoming a distraction from our fundraising efforts. Victoria realized that she was being punished for Marcus's actions, but she also began to understand that his arrogance and entitlement had been obvious to many people for years. Friends and colleagues had tolerated his behavior because of his wealth and influence, but the viral video had made it impossible to ignore his character flaws. The Wellington Dynamics Board finally made their decision. In a unanimous vote, they removed Marcus as CEO and appointed Jennifer Walsh, the former head of public relations, as interim chief executive. The decision was announced in a carefully worded statement that emphasized the company's commitment to values and professionalism. Wellington Dynamics was built on innovation and integrity, the statement read. Recent events involving our founder do not reflect the values of our company or our employees. We are taking immediate action to distance ourselves from Mr. Wellington's personal conduct and ensure the continued success of our organization. The stock market responded positively to Marcus's removal, with Wellington Dynamics shares recovering slightly as investors gained confidence in the company's new leadership. The message was clear. Marcus Wellington had become a liability to his own business empire. As his first week in Pentonville Prison began, Marcus sat in his small cell wearing a standard prison uniform instead of his designer suits. His cellmate was a career criminal named Tommy Richardson who found Marcus's fall from grace amusing and educational. Never seen someone destroy their whole life in 30 seconds like that, Tommy observed. Must be some kind of record. Marcus was beginning to understand that his moment of entitled rage had cost him everything he had spent his life building, and the worst consequences were yet to come. Life in Pentonville Prison was a brutal awakening for Marcus Wellington. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and controlled billions of dollars was now standing in line for prison meals alongside murderers, drug dealers, and career criminals. His fellow inmates showed him no deference for his former status, and several seemed to take pleasure in seeing a wealthy American brought down to their level. "Look what we got here," sneered Derek Morrison, a violent offender serving time for armed robbery. "The famous CEO who thinks he's better than everyone else. Not so special in here, are you, rich boy?" The irony of sharing a surname with the guard Marcus had assaulted was not lost on anyone in the prison. Marcus quickly learned that his wealth meant nothing behind bars. The commissary prices were fixed, the guards treated all prisoners equally, and his expensive lawyers could only visit during designated hours like everyone else's legal representation. For the first time in his adult life, money could not solve his immediate problems or improve his circumstances. His cellmate Tommy Richardson had been watching Marcus's adjustment with dark amusement. "You still don't get it, do you?" Tommy said, one evening as Marcus stared at the ceiling from his narrow bunk. "That guard you spat on represents everything you never understood about real honor and duty." "He was just standing there like a statue," Marcus replied, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held a week earlier. "I was trying to get to an important meeting, and he was blocking my path with his silly ceremonial nonsense." Tommy laughed harshly. "Ceremonial nonsense? That man served in Afghanistan, mate. Seen real combat, saved real lives. While you were making money from your office, he was dodging bullets and protecting his mates, and you spat on him because he wouldn't break protocol for your precious meeting." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. In his corporate world, he had been surrounded by people who praised his intelligence and success. No one had ever forced him to confront the reality that his achievements, while impressive, had never involved real sacrifice or service to others. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the story continued to evolve in ways that deepened Marcus's disgrace. An investigative journalist named David Chen had begun researching Marcus's business practices and personal history, uncovering a pattern of entitled behavior that went far beyond the palace incident. Wellington has a history of treating service workers, employees, and anyone he considers beneath his status with contempt, David reported on his evening news program. "We've spoken to former employees who describe a workplace culture of fear and intimidation, where Marcus Wellington's mood swings and arrogant demands created a toxic environment for hundreds of workers." Former Wellington Dynamics employees began speaking publicly about their experiences. Sarah Martinez, a former executive assistant, described how Marcus had once thrown a coffee cup at her because she had scheduled a meeting 5 minutes later than he preferred. "He treated people like objects," she told reporters. The palace incident was just the first time his behavior was recorded and went viral. The revelations were devastating for Marcus's reputation and for any hope of rebuilding his image after the trial. What had initially appeared to be a single moment of bad judgment was being revealed as part of a long pattern of abusive behavior toward people he considered inferior. Sergeant James Morrison was also struggling with his newfound fame. Though his challenges were very different from Marcus's, the military had decided to award him a commendation for his professionalism under assault, and the ceremony was scheduled to take place at Buckingham Palace, with significant media coverage. "I never wanted this attention," James confided to his girlfriend Emma during one of her visits. "I joined the Guard to serve quietly and honorably, not to become a symbol in some viral video." But Emma helped him understand that his response to Marcus's attack had inspired people around the world. "You showed millions of people what real dignity looks like," Emma told him. "When someone tried to humiliate you, you maintained your honor and your duty. That means something to people who see too much selfishness and arrogance in the world." The trial date was approaching, and Marcus's legal team was desperately trying to negotiate a plea bargain. Elizabeth Hartwell had been joined by 2 additional barristers specializing in high-profile criminal cases. But the video evidence and public attention made their job nearly impossible. "The Crown Prosecution Service is offering 18 months in prison if you plead guilty to assault on a Crown servant," Elizabeth explained during a prison visit. "Given the circumstances and your not guilty plea, if we go to trial and lose, you could face the maximum sentence of 2 years plus additional penalties." Marcus's pride was still fighting against accepting responsibility for his actions. 18 months for spitting at someone? This is insane. In any reasonable legal system, this would be a fine and community service at most. His inability to understand the severity of assaulting a military representative continued to baffle his legal team. Mr. Wellington, you need to understand that you're not just being punished for spitting, Elizabeth explained patiently. You physically grabbed a soldier, verbally abused him, and then assaulted him while he was performing his duties protecting the crown. The British legal system takes attacks on military personnel very seriously. Back in New York, Victoria Wellington was facing her own reckoning. The divorce papers had been filed, and she was being advised by her lawyers to distance herself completely from Marcus to protect her own assets and reputation. The comfortable life of charity galas and luxury shopping had been replaced by legal meetings and financial planning sessions. Your husband's actions have made him toxic to the business and social communities, her lawyer, Patricia Stevens, explained bluntly. Your best option is a clean break that protects your financial interests and allows you to rebuild your reputation independently. Victoria was discovering that many of the people she had considered friends were actually just associates, who had tolerated her and Marcus because of their wealth and social position. With Marcus facing prison and their fortune under legal scrutiny, these fair-weather friends had quickly disappeared. The Wellington Dynamics Board had voted to change the company name to Dynamics Technologies, completely removing Marcus's name and legacy from the business he had founded. The decision was overwhelmingly supported by employees, who reported feeling relieved to work for a company no longer associated with Marcus's behavior. We're not just changing our name, Interim CEO Jennifer Walsh announced. We're changing our culture. We're implementing new policies on workplace respect, employee treatment, and executive behavior that will ensure this kind of situation never happens again. As Marcus lay on his prison bunk, listening to the sounds of Pentonville at night, he was beginning to understand that his moment of entitled rage had cost him everything. His company, his wealth, his marriage, his reputation, and his freedom were all gone or seriously damaged. The royal guard he had so casually disrespected had maintained his honor and dignity, while Marcus had destroyed his own life in 30 seconds of viral video. The harsh reality check was complete, but the consequences were far from over. His trial was still approaching, and the world was watching to see if justice would truly be served for his assault on a British soldier. The trial of Marcus Wellington began on a cold November morning, 6 weeks after his assault on Sergeant James Morrison. The courtroom at the Old Bailey was packed with international media, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case since the viral video first appeared online. Security was unprecedented, with armed police and court officers ensuring order in what had become one of the most watched trials in recent British legal history. Marcus entered the dock wearing a standard prison uniform, looking nothing like the arrogant billionaire who had stepped out of his Rolls-Royce at Buckingham Palace weeks earlier. His expensive suits had been replaced with gray institutional clothing, his perfectly styled hair was unkempt, and his face showed the strain of 6 weeks in Pentonville prison. The transformation was so dramatic that some reporters didn't immediately recognize him. Judge Sarah Pemberton, known for her no-nonsense approach to high-profile cases, presided over the proceedings with stern authority. She had reviewed all the evidence, including the multiple video recordings of the incident, and her opening remarks made it clear that celebrity status would not influence her courtroom. This trial will proceed based on evidence and law, not on media attention or public opinion, Judge Pemberton announced. The defendant stands accused of assault on a Crown servant, specifically Sergeant James Morrison of the Grenadier Guards, while that officer was performing his lawful duties. The prosecution, led by Crown Barrister Michael Thornton, began by playing the clearest video recording of the assault. The courtroom watched in silence as Marcus approached Sergeant Morrison, became increasingly aggressive, grabbed the guard's arm, and finally spat directly at his face. The audio captured Marcus's insulting words clearly, including his dismissal of the guard as a dressed-up dummy and toy soldier. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Thornton addressed the 12 citizens who would decide Marcus's fate. You have just witnessed a clear and unprovoked assault on a British soldier performing his duties. Sergeant Morrison maintained his professionalism throughout this attack, while the defendant escalated his behavior from verbal abuse to physical contact to assault. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They called Inspector David Hayes, who testified about Marcus's behavior during the arrest and his continued arrogance even after being taken into custody. Tourist witnesses described the incident from multiple angles, all confirming that Marcus had initiated the confrontation without any provocation from the guard. When Sergeant James Morrison took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. Still in his military uniform, he testified with the same professionalism he had shown during the assault. His dignity and measured responses created a stark contrast with the aggressive behavior shown in the videos. Sergeant Morrison, Prosecutor Thornton asked, "Can you describe your feelings when the defendant spat at you?" "I felt disgusted and angry, sir," James replied honestly. "But my training and duty required me to maintain my position and composure. Breaking protocol would have dishonored my regiment and my service to the Crown." The defense team, led by Elizabeth Hartwell, faced an almost impossible task. The video evidence was clear, there were dozens of witnesses, and Marcus had shown no remorse for his actions. Their strategy focused on arguing that Marcus had been under extreme stress from international business pressures and jet lag, hoping to minimize the sentence rather than achieve acquittal. "My client deeply regrets his actions on that day," Elizabeth told the jury during her opening statement. Marcus Wellington was under enormous pressure from business obligations and was not thinking clearly. While his behavior was inexcusable, it was an isolated incident from a man who has contributed significantly to technological advancement and job creation. But when Marcus took the stand in his own defense, his arrogance and lack of genuine remorse became apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Despite weeks of coaching from his legal team, he could not convincingly express understanding of why his behavior had been so offensive. "I was frustrated and acted impulsively," Marcus testified. "I didn't realize that spitting at someone would be considered such a serious crime. In my business experience, when someone ignores you, it's usually because they don't understand the importance of the situation." Prosecutor Thornton's cross-examination was ruthless and effective. "Mr. Wellington, did you consider that Sergeant Morrison might have been ignoring you because he was performing his military duties?" "I suppose that's possible," Marcus replied. "But important business matters sometimes require flexibility and protocol." "Important business matters? More important than a soldier's duty to protect the Crown?" Marcus's answer sealed his fate. "Well, the economic impact of my business decisions affects thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. Standing guard is traditional, but not necessarily productive." The courtroom gasped at his response, and Judge Pemberton had to call for order. Even Marcus's own legal team looked horrified at his testimony, realizing that their client had just demonstrated the same arrogance that had led to his assault on the guard. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. Judge Pemberton scheduled sentencing for the following week, and Marcus was returned to Pentonville to await his fate. On sentencing day, the courtroom was again packed as Judge Pemberton prepared to deliver justice. She had received hundreds of letters from military personnel, veterans, and members of the public, most calling for the maximum sentence to send a message about respecting those who serve their country. "Marcus Wellington," Judge Pemberton began, "your assault on Sergeant Morrison was not just an attack on an individual soldier, but an insult to all who serve in our armed forces. Your behavior demonstrated a level of entitlement and arrogance that has no place in civilized society." The judge sentenced Marcus to 2 years in prison, the maximum penalty for his crime. She also ordered him to pay substantial fines and court costs, and to issue a formal public apology to Sergeant Morrison and the British military. "Your actions on that day revealed your true character," Judge Pemberton concluded. "You showed contempt for duty, honor, and service while expecting special treatment based on your wealth. This sentence reflects society's rejection of such values." As Marcus was led away to begin his full prison sentence, Sergeant James Morrison sat in the gallery with his girlfriend Emma. The justice had been served, but James took no pleasure in seeing another man's life destroyed, even one who had treated him with such disrespect. Outside the courthouse, the media reported on what had become a global symbol of accountability for entitled behavior. The viral video of Marcus's assault had been viewed over 50 million times, and his conviction was being celebrated as proof that wealth and status could not protect someone from the consequences of their actions. Marcus Wellington returned to Pentonville Prison to serve his full sentence, his business empire lost, his marriage over, and his reputation destroyed forever. The 30 seconds of entitled rage that had led him to spit at a royal guard had cost him everything he had spent his life building. Sergeant Morrison returned to his duties with the Queen's Guard, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had made him a hero to millions around the world. His professional response to Marcus's assault had demonstrated that true strength comes from honor, duty, and respect for others, values that no amount of money can buy. The harsh reality check was complete. Marcus Wellington had learned in the most painful way possible that actions have consequences, and that treating others with contempt and disrespect ultimately destroys the person who chooses such behavior. His moment of viral infamy would serve as a lasting reminder that character matters more than wealth and that true dignity cannot be bought or sold.